Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me tonight. I'm excited, if you're watching on the replay or live, to tell you all about what to do for your entire beekeeping season. I have a visual slideshow to go with me talking over it. I'm going to tell you literally every step I take for the entire beekeeping season. And it won't be just applicable to people in my area. A lot of the stuff I do can be modified and changed dates wise and some of the specifics of it to fit any beekeeping climate, like anywhere you keep bees, it could work. So this could be helpful for literally anyone. It's not just beekeepers who are in mid-coast Maine. This just gives a framework for the entire beekeeping season. If you have any questions, leave them in the chat, or if you're watching the replay, put them in the comment section and I'll be happy to answer any of them. So here we go. I will add the presentation and we'll get going here. So I'm very excited. I did a similar video to this a year ago where I did this, but in way, way less depth. So I'm excited to share what I've learned over the past 6 years of beekeeping to share that with others and help them plan out their beekeeping season as beginners or experienced beekeepers, just dialing in the calendar, getting the dates just right. So you're not a reactive beekeeper, you're a proactive beekeeper. You know what to do and when based on the season. So in December, I'm starting in December and I'm going to go all the way back to December the next year. So in December, I leave my bees alone. I don't need to be near them. The University of Guelph did a study and they found that if you walk up to the beehives during the winter, they actually raise their temperature and waste some of their energy. So you really don't want to visit your bees in December if at all possible, because it makes them waste some extra heat energy and you really, really don't want that to happen. So make sure that you just leave your bees alone in December. At least that's what I do. And I think it's just important for you to do that. So then our next slide here, mid-February, as you can see on the picture on the left, the bees will often get a really warm day in February. And so they'll carry out all their dead bees and poop all over the snow. And when they do this, you know that each hive is alive when you see them carrying out dead bees. Dead bees in the snow is a good sign because it means your hives are alive. Taking out the dead bees and throwing them outside. Naturally, a lot of bees die during the winter. It's nothing to be worried about. Just notice that if they're pulling them out. And this is the month, typically around mid-February, where I go through each hive and lift the back of the hive. And over time, you get a sense of how heavy they need to be for winter. And make sure you lift them up in fall. So that helps you get an idea of how much food they have. And you lift up on the back. If they're really heavy, you don't need to feed them. If they aren't heavy, then I would go in and give them sugar candy or dry sugar. I prefer dry sugar. It's super easy and fast. Just get some kind of shim, or your top, like outer cover, inner cover, can have a shim for you to put the sugar on. So that's what I like to do in mid-February. And also in mid-February, you don't need a warm day for this. I go through, I write down all the equipment I'm going to need. I write down my goals for the year. So like how many hives I want, how many frames of honey, whatever each goals I have for that year. And I just write them down. So it helps me plan and get focused for the season ahead. And it's made a big difference in helping me figure out what I want before I want it, so then I can get everything in order to have that great beekeeping season that I want. So then we go to, here's the equipment and putting on the sugar. I don't use wired frames, but I do use plastic foundation. Some people don't like it, but it works really well for me, so I use that. And then the picture on the right, that's just like a normal deep box setup. So it's reminding you to order your equipment, and there's some sugar and the bees eating it during the wintertime. So next slide, I like to melt down my old frames and melt them down, clear them off, switch out the foundation if need be, especially if you have wax foundation, you won't be able to scrape it off. You'll need to switch it out. And by doing that, you're getting ready for the next year. And so you'll have all that equipment ready when you need it to. You can re-wax it in February or March, but ideally you'd want to wait till May or June right before you put it on the beehives, because the bees are going to like it the most if you freshly painted the wax right onto it. So we're going to look at the comment section here. Hey, Rainier. Hey, Grayson. Hope you're doing well. We've got Grayson. He's from South Alabama. And then Brian is from Wisconsin. I just started powdering my own sugar cane for homemade sugar patties. Bees seem to like 100% powdered cane sugar patties. No cornstarch. Huh. That's interesting. I never heard of that, Brian. Thank you for being on here. He's here from Wisconsin. Just make sure you guys put any questions in the chat about anything I'm doing or why I'm doing it. Happy to explain in further detail. So this is, replacing the frames. I'll do that in February or March. Then in early March, about 2 weeks later from your first check where you add sugar on the ones that are heady, I go through all my hives again. I lift the back. If they still have enough food, then I go ahead and still not put any sugar on them. The ones that do have sugar, I go in there, look to see if they're eating the sugar. If they're not eating the sugar, then I don't add any more. If they've eaten a lot of the sugar or some of the sugar, then I go ahead and put some more on. I really only do this on warm days. So if the temperatures are, 35, any 35 or below, you really don't want to go in to put sugar on them. It's just not a good idea and they're going to be unhappy. So I typically only want to add that extra sugar if it's at least 45 degrees, which is pretty typical for us in early March. We'll get a day that's 45 degrees. And then we move on to late March. So in late March, as seen on the screen, the crocuses bloom. That's my sign for when to put on pollen patties. It's typically when the first bees start to bring in pollen, and it's not a huge source of pollen because they're such small flowers, but they can bring some pollen in from them, and that's really what gets the queen laying. She'll start laying, and where I live, typically in late January or early February, but she really starts to take off in late March. And late March, I like to put on pollen patties. Whenever the crocuses bloom, which is typically late March, between the 16th and the 31st is what I have written down here, I want to be adding those pollen patties because of the crocuses. And if the crocuses are blooming, it's a warm enough day to put on pollen patties normally. One important note when it comes to pollen patties is you want to put them directly over the bee cluster. If you put them off to the side, it's really hard for the bees to eat them and use them for brood rearing. You want to put them directly over the main part of the cluster. And the best way to tell where the main part of the cluster is instead of looking from the top frames, from the bars, you want to pick up the box, especially if they don't have sugar on, because that makes it easy. Look from the underside, and bees lie from the top, but they don't lie from the bottom. You'll be able to see right where the bees are really clustering by looking from the bottom of the frames, and that's where you want to put your patty, wherever corresponding with where the bees are focused on the bottom, put it on the top side. If you put the pollen patty on the bottom board, the bees treat it as trash and don't eat it like they would if you put it on top. So that's one important part when it comes to pollen patties. We got a comment from Brian J. Madair. I use apple cider vinegar with the mother in my powdered sugar patties. Huh. I've genuinely never heard of that, Brian, so I'm very interested. Then once we get into late March, I make sure to make any modifications to my beekeeping plan for the rest of the year. So if I want to, do a new mite test, or I don't know, use UBO, it's like a breeding tool. So I'm getting all that stuff prepared and ready. So when the actual beekeeping, like main beekeeping season in May and June and July hit, I'm completely prepared and I can get everything done that I want to. So this is when I'm, dialing in my calendar, like I did today. I wrote all these dates down and just kind of adjusting anything that I think needed to be from the year before. And that just helps me stay focused, stay on time, and stay productive. So I like to do that in late March. And by late March, I like to have my dead outs all cleaned out. I go into the hives, scrape off all the dead bees, chuck them outside, make sure the entrance reducer or mouse guards are on, because if they're not, that causes big problems. And the mites, here's the pollen patties, and the mites, or sorry, not mites. And the mice will get into the dead outs if you don't have an entrance reducer or metal mouse guard on there. It's really, really important to have that. Otherwise, they'll make a nest and destroy some of your frames. Got the pollen patties. Got to put that sugar on the bees. And here are some of my dead outs from this year. There's a video that you can watch after this where I break down all my dead outs and why they died, or my best guess. Over time, you figure out how to do that, and it's important to look at your dead outs, try to figure out why your hives died, so you can adjust your beekeeping practices that coming year, so you don't lose the same amount of hives. And you're probably always going to lose a certain amount of bees over winter, but the best you can minimize that, the better you'll be, and the more bees you'll have. So then this is like, I had a couple hives that look like this. The bottom board is completely full of dead bees. It's terrible. Hate it, but you know, it's just how it goes. So then we get here to early April, and I like to check pollen patties about 2 weeks after I put them on. So let's say you put them on the 23rd, you know, there's 31 days in March, you're in around April 6th. And like I said, you only want to do this on warmer days, so around 45 degrees. And once it's at 45-degree temperature range, put on those pollen patties. And once you have them on, or once you're checking them on all the hives, then if the big ones need more pollen patty, put it on there. If a hive hasn't eaten their pollen patty, then there's no reason to add more. Most of the time they don't eat none. And if they eat no pollen patty, it's really, really an issue. Your hives probably queenless if they eat zero pollen patty at all. But you want to adjust how much pollen patty you put on each individual colony to how large their size are. And so small colony, give less patty, big colony, give more patty. It's not rocket science. So that's what you want to do when it comes to pollen patties. It's around April 6th, you know, early April date. And that pollen patty is just incredibly important. And you don't want the pollen patty to be eaten by hive beetles if you're in a more southern location. So that's another reason why not to give them too much and have them eat it quickly. The other issue is the patties, even with the paper, can dry out over time. And you really don't want that to happen. So make sure that you give the appropriate amount of patty per hive. You'll figure it out pretty quick. Maybe you'll lose some at the beginning, but you'll figure out pretty quickly how much each hive needs depending on the size and the time it is of the year, and just like even more specifically what time of spring it is. So then this time I also like to go through all of my frames that aren't currently in use, go through every single frame and absolutely make sure that they're all sorted. I sort them into undrawn frames, partially drawn frames, and fully drawn frames. This photo is of my honey supers, but I also do it with all the deep frames I have. I sort them out. I write, you know, markings on the boxes so I know which box has which types of frame. It's incredibly important. It saves a ton of time in the summertime and spring when you need to use your equipment to know where it is and, you know, have it labeled just to streamline the whole process. Got a question here from Brian here. Have you ever used the green spirulina patties, pollen patties? I have not, Brian. I've only used kind of like the classic Man Lake Dadant patty. And then the past couple of years, I prefer the global patties, which I'll be using again this year. That's typically what I use for my patties. Give me 1 second. I need a drink of water. So now you've done everything you need to do in early April, and we get to mid to late April. Mid to late April is where I do my first inspections. So I go through all my hives really quickly, and I make sure that each of them have a certain amount of frames of brood. And how many frames of brood I equalize each colony into depends on the specific date in which it is. So for mid-April, I'm looking for my average date is around the 17th of April. I add pollen patty first, if they're still eating it, which they start to slow down around this time because they're getting more flying days and more pollen. And when they're getting all this pollen, the bees are less likely to eat the pollen patty. It's pretty simple, but add pollen patty to the hives that still are eating it, because if they're eating it, they still probably need it, at least to a certain extent. And then once you've got a pollen patty situation taken care of, when I'm inspecting, I want to do very quick inspections, probably like 5 to 7 minutes per hive. I go through, I count how many frames of brood they have. Then I equalize in between the hives. So I make sure that each hive has, I think I wrote down, yeah, 3 frames of brood in mid-April, and I want them to have probably 3 frames of honey. So if they don't have 3 frames of brood or 3 frames of honey, I'm going to pull from other hives and make sure that they have those 3 frames of brood. Here's the pollen patties in the brood. Those are some beautiful spring brood frames right there. Adding the pollen patty again. So I make sure that they don't, or that they do have at least 3 frames of brood, or really like 3 to 4, and then at least 2 frames of honey, ideally 3 or 4 frames of honey. And that way they're all the same. And so ones won't swarm early, that are really big, and the ones that started really small will actually build up for the beekeeping season and won't be just left in the dust. Then in mid-April, or back to equalizing, a couple other tips when it comes to equalizing is you want to pick the frames that are emerging. You need emerging brood because it heats itself quite quickly. The bees hatch really quickly. And then once they hatch, they start heating themselves. So once that brood hatches, then the new queen in the weaker hive can start laying into it, and it's not a lot of work for the weak hive, and so the brood won't get chilled during that early spring period. And when you're doing this equalizing, you want to make sure to not give a queen, move the queen from the big hive to the small hive on accident and get her killed. So I like to find the queen. Once I get bigger, what I'll do is end up just looking really carefully on a frame. And if I can't see her, and I'm pretty good at finding queens, then I know she's not there. But if you're a smaller beekeeper, you really do want to find the queen before you equalize, because if you lose a queen that time of year, it's devastating because you can't, I mean, I guess you could order one from the south, but there are no local queens and it will set your hive back a considerable amount. And with colder temperatures, it's harder to introduce queens. And you can also shake in extra bees into whatever hive you're equalizing. So if you're equalizing that hive, then find the queen in the bigger hive, shake frames of bees into the smaller hive to make sure the brood doesn't get chilled. That typically works. You want to look for the frames that have larvae because that'll have all the nurse bees on it. And so those nurse bees will actually be willing to stay, whereas the foragers are programmed to fly back to their old hive's location. So no matter what happens when they fly out and forage, when they come back, they'll go back to their old hive. So those new nurse bees haven't flown and oriented to the hive, and that way they don't know how to get back, so they'll stay in your weaker colony that you've equalized from a strong colony. Then we move on to or mid to late April. I don't have like any specific management after I do that first inspection, so I was just writing a note that it gets considerably warmer during this time period pretty quickly, and it gives the bees many more flying days and foraging opportunities, so they really start to gain in the amount of forage they have and or that's available to them. So it's a pretty important time of the year for the bees. Then we get to early May, and I like to do 3 rounds of equalizing, and early May is the second round of equalizing. So we get to early May, and once again, you want to add patty, pollen patty to the bees. That's, of course, if they need it. If they're not eating the pollen patty, their last one, then don't add more because you're just wasting your money. But if they keep eating the patty, keep giving them to them. In early May, that's probably the last time you want to give them pollen patty for this time for the spring, because after that, they won't eat it and they just get a ton of pollen in. So it's really not necessary after that point. Then I want to do the second round of equalizing. So all my hives ideally would have around 4 to 5 frames of brood and at least 2 frames of honey, ideally like 3 or 4 like before, which how would they, raise a bunch of brood but not decrease in the amount of honey they have? If they're starting to bring in food, it's not a ton, but it can be enough to sustain them without really dipping too far into their honey reserves. It also depends on where the honey is located. If the honey is located right next to the brood nest, then they're going to have to eat that or move it away from the brood nest as they want to expand the brood nest during the springtime. So it's pretty important to have that honey, but it can be cumbersome and cause some swarming in the spring, which I can get to later. So then once everybody's equalized to 4 to 5 frames of brood, 2 to 3 frames of honey, this is the time of year where the bees start to draw comb. Here's some pollen and capped brood here. But this is really when they start to draw comb. I had a picture for this, but unfortunately it wouldn't upload, so I can't show it to you, but I can post a link to it in the description. But this is when the bees start to draw comb. And so it's just a really fun time of year because the nectar is finally starting to come in. There's tons of pollen in early May, and the season's really getting going and starting to have the bees are starting to get a lot of forward momentum. So it's really exciting. And this is also the time of year where I wax all my frames in the first 2 weeks of May. You might ask, well, why did you wait till the first 2 weeks of May? Because couldn't you have done that in the wintertime and saved yourself hard work during the actual bee season? And yes, I could have, but the reason why I wait is because I saw live chat with Blake Shook and Cayman Reynolds last year, and they were talking about how bees much prefer, if this is if you use plastic foundation, as I do, they much prefer a plastic foundation that's just been re-waxed rather than if I re-wax it in February, put it on the hives in May, the bees are much less interested in drawing it out. And so I want to give them the best chance possible of drawing it out. And so that's why I wait till the first 2 weeks of May to re-wax all my super frames and many of my deep frames that hadn't been drawn out the year before, but that were in hives. So it just gives them a much better chance. Then we get around to mid-May, which is like almost the height of beekeeping season. It's not the height of the flow, but it's maybe the most fun time of year for me personally. Let me know in the live chat or the comments, what's your favorite time of the beekeeping year? Like, when are you having the most fun and most positively associated with bees? Let me know in the chat, or if you're watching the replay in the comments. I'm curious to hear because, like I said, for me, it's mid-May. So in mid-May, around the 15th, I prepare my cell builder. So I've used many different methods in the past, but that'd be its own video to explain all that stuff. So, but I prepare my cell builder and graft on the 15th of May. There's copious amounts of pollen this time of year. And here's the grafting. These are actually 2 cells that I grafted. It's really interesting because you can see the new wax cells on the queen cell on the left, because it's kind of white. There's like white scales because the bees just put it on there compared to the darker yellow on the other stuff. So that's one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken. And there's a good amount of nectar. As I said, tons of pollen. And this is my final round of equalizing. So I like to do typically 3 rounds. You can equalize all throughout the summer, but out of the specific spring equalizing, this is the most important time. So I really like to go through all the hives again, equalize. Each one should have 6 to 7 frames of brood. And then I add 1 medium honey super to all the really strong hives in mid-May. The reason why I don't add it, like, I know you said, well, you just equalized everyone. Shouldn't they be the same size? They might have the same amount of brood, but some might have a lot more bees than others and be growing a lot faster. So the ones that are growing really fast and have a lot of bees, I'll add a honey super to. And unless it's going to be super cold at night. If it's really cold at night, then I'm not going to add the honey super. It's just not worth the risk. I don't like that idea of losing brood because there's some dead space above the brood nest. So, but assuming it's not going to be really cold, like into the 30s, adding a super on strong hives is completely fine. And I will use a queen excluder if the comb's drawn. If the comb's not drawn, I won't use a queen excluder. The bees will draw comb through a queen excluder, but they're less likely to. So, whatever. I'm just not gonna risk it. I still got a month and a half before I harvest, or 2 months really. So if I've got 2 months before I harvest my honey, then I can always push the queen down, shake all the bees, put on a queen excluder, then put the supers back on. And once they start drawing comb above the excluder, they'll keep drawing comb above the excluder. And I also, in mid-May, I really like to checkerboard. So I'll take an undrawn frame or a partially drawn frame and shove it into the middle of the brood nest. And the reason why I do this is because the bees in mid-May are really wanting to draw comb. And so if I can get them to draw 1 or 2 frames of comb in the middle of the brood nest, that would be great. I'd probably only do 1 so you don't separate the brood too much, or isolate any 1 frame of brood on its own. But use the time of the year to your advantage to get that new deep drawn comb for yourself. I just love seeing that beautiful new white wax on the frames. So now that you've gone through that, you've added the frame, you've checkerboarded into the, and I should have said this, but on the biggest hives you want to checkerboard. You could probably try it on most of them, and you're far enough into the year where it's not going to chill any brood, but it's probably only going to get drawn quickly on the ones that are big. So that's something else you need to keep in mind. On average, my queen cells that I grafted are already on the 25th of May. I can split the whole week coming into that using the queen excluder method. There are probably hundreds of videos on how to split with queen excluders. So I'll just give a really short overview of that. For me, what I do is as much as a week in advance, I go through the bottom boxes of single deeps. I find the frames I want to split. If I'm splitting in a week, I can pull frames of larvae or eggs up above the queen excluder, because then 7 days later, that's when I'm going to be pulling them off into their own box, or 5 days later. So yeah, I shake the frames off that I want. I put on a queen excluder, put on a second deep, and put those frames into that second deep. And now that they're in that second deep, I can pull them at any time I want in the next few days. All the bees will come up through the excluder, cover that brood, keep it warm. And then once we get to, once I'm ready to split them, pull the frames right off. It takes like 2 minutes instead of 40 minutes to find the queen, then find the frames of brood, then be done. So that's just a huge time saver for me. And I like to have, so capture brood's great in the sense that it hatches really quickly and it's not a lot of work for the bees. They don't need to feed it. They just need to keep it warm, and especially emerging brood, even less time where they need to keep warm, less work. It's more self-heating. But larva helps the bees get locked to the box, which meaning like they are less likely to leave your split. If you're splitting within the same yard, all the forager bees, like I said, will go home. And so if all the forager bees are going home, you're going to be left with very few bees. And you generally get less bees leaving your box if you have a frame of larvae in there. That's what I've heard. To an extent, I've also experienced that, but it's really hard without doing any kind of trial to know that for sure. But that's tend to be what I found is use some larvae, some emerging brood, and kind of just see how it works out, but really shake a lot of bees. That's the biggest lesson. You can move your splits to a different yard if you're a bigger beekeeper that has multiple yards, but the only downside to that is they're less likely to accept your queen cells, because the old foragers will be stuck in that box with the young bees, and they are more likely, the old foragers, to destroy your queen cells. So that's one thing to consider. Unfortunate, but a lot of beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, will do it anyway because it just simplifies everything so much to have all those foragers stay in the box. So then however many bees you shake in the box, that's how many stay. So that it does simplify things, but ideally you'd keep it in the same yard and shake in enough bees to have all young bees. And that split will grow a lot faster if it's all young bees, because they have a lot more life to live, producing wax, making babies. They're just more ideal for splitting, and they'll grow faster if they're a bunch of young bees in there. And each split will get, jumping ahead here. So yeah, okay, never mind. Each split will get 2 frames of brood, 1 frame of honey, and 2 undrawn frames. And that's kind of how I like to make up my nukes. I ran a lot of queen castles, which are 3 frame compartments, but I don't really think I'll be doing that this year. And in general, in the future, I'm not sure if that's going to be happening. 5 frame nukes, way easier. Highly recommend them. Or 6 frame. Both work great. And you want to be feeding when you're doing the split. It's just incredibly important to feed, because that increases your chance of the queen cells being accepted. I'd feed probably 2 days before on your nukes, before you install the queen cell, and maybe 2 days after as well. And that just gives them, happy bees are more likely to accept queens. They're less stressed. It just makes everything easier for them. So use those queens. Use the sugar water to help get those queen cells accepted. The queen cells will hatch. And if you graft on the 15th, the cells are pulled out on the 25th. They should hatch within 2 to 3 days, and at the very most 4 days from when you grafted them. And so they'll hatch, walk around for a while, then go out in a mating flight, and hopefully come back to your hive and start laying eggs. And we got James Noel here in the chat. Thank you for joining us, James. We started a little later tonight. because I was getting this prep for everyone. So like during this time of year when the cell builders are around, there's tons of pollen. So this is from mid-April, but there's even more pollen in mid-May and late April. It's really fun. You can see on the bottom right there's green pollen, and that comes from I believe the Norwood maple. Correct me in the chat or the comment section if you know what that green pollen from mid-April is, but I'm 90% sure it's a Norwood maple or Norway. Could be wrong on that, but. And then you can see in the middle of the frame there are eggs, and there's some yellow pollen that might be dandelion. I'm not entirely sure. And there's some also nectar on the other frame on the left. So there's tons of pollen that time of year. Then I've gotten all of my splits done in late May and added queen cells. If I am adding queen cells a couple days, like I allow them to be queenless in their nuke for a couple days, then I add the queen cells. I like to go in and destroy all the queen cells. They'll probably accept the queen anyways. She'll hatch and then destroy all the other queen cells, but I just like to be safe, so I'll try to destroy all the queen cells if I can. That's ideal. They can just make more if they have the right age larva in the nuke. So it may not matter, but I think it kind of helps to a certain extent to destroy the queen cells. So the new virgin queen will have to do less work. And you're feeding the syrup, and a couple other factors go into queen mating. So ideally you have drone flooding yards. Queens fly really far distance, so they don't mate with the drones from their own colonies and create inbreeding. So if you have yards between 3/4 of a mile and a mile and a half away from your mating yard, then your bees are going to do better, and they're going to mate. More of them will get mated. And ideally, you'd have 3 drone flooding yards in different directions. I mean, even 5 would be better, but if you could have 2 or 3, or even 1 is better than none. So that will help increase your mating percentages by as much as 15% if you get those drone flooding yards correct. The other thing is, if you can have a yard devoted for just your nukes, queens are more likely to come back when there's less traffic from larger size colonies. So if you just go in there and you have 1 yard for your nukes, more of them are going to come back from their mating flight. You're going to have more bees and more mated queens, which is the super fun part of the year, is seeing those brand new mated queens. And those colonies explode really quickly and start drawing out a lot of comb. So that's also a really important part of your operation, is using those nukes to draw comb in the springtime. So then, oh, and the last note on queen mating is try not to use pallets. Or not that many beekeepers use pallets unless you're bigger, but if you're, mid-size sideliner beekeeper, if you use pallets, then your queens are less likely to come back mated, which is not an issue for large colonies because, only 1 of them or maybe 2 of them on a pallet are queenless at a time. So it's, lowers your percentages by like 10%. But if you're mating at like, 35 queens or 40 queens, then it's totally worth it to try to put them against a tree line and not on pallets. It'll give them a much better chance at finding their way back into the mating nuke, which, well, be more money for you. You have to graft less queens, or you can sell more queens, or you have more queens. It's just better. So try not to use pallets if possible when you're mating nukes. So then I pull, when I'm doing all these splits, I'm pulling all the hives back to maybe 5 to 6 frames of brood. And this helps alleviate swarming. Our prime swarm season is probably mid-May to mid-June. And then, you can get swarms in early May. You can get swarms in late June, early July. That's our prime swarm season here in Mid-Coast Maine. So by splitting all those hives back to a specific size, you can greatly decrease swarming. You can't wipe it out entirely. No one can entirely stop swarming, but it'll make a pretty significant difference in how many swarms you have in a given year if you're able to pull them all back at the same time. And I want to add a second super to the really big hives when I'm doing that second split, or first split in mid to late May. So that second super will just give me more space, especially when I add the super if the first one's drawn. They'll probably fill it up really quickly because they won't have to draw the comb. So consider adding that second super in late May. Then on June 5th, I graft again. In early June, I average around June 8th. I check the first round of splits. I like to wait 14 days to check my splits. And typically if the queen's not back in 14 days, then I like to combine the hive. So I go through all those nukes that I made from the first round, whether it's 10 or 100. I go through each one, look for eggs. If I find eggs, then I leave them alone. You could feed them, but we're pretty good into the honey flow. There's tons of pollen coming in early June. And it's not like the prime flow, but there's still a decent amount of flow at that time of year. It's just an awesome time of year. It's so fun to be a beekeeper in early June in Maine. And so I go through all those. Any hives that don't have eggs, I assume they don't have a queen. And if they don't have a queen, I combine them with the other nukes and I give their drawn comb away. If I keep waiting, maybe a couple of more queens will come back, but I rather get that comb into strong hives with laying queens and protect it from, wax moth or any small amount of hive beetles. We don't have that many hive beetles here, but it could theoretically happen. So probably 70 to 80% of those queens will come back from their mating flight, depending on, like I said, the pallets, having an exclusive nuke yard, in your drone flooding yards. Those 3 factors will influence your mating. You can, if you get all 3 of those right, you can be closer to 95% of the queens will come back from their mating flight. And at this time, I also will poll queens to requeen my production hive. So a lot of people only requeen when you have to. Bob Binney requeens every hive every year. It's one method, takes more work, takes more time, but you're less likely to have a hive go downhill and die on you if all of them have brand new queens, or well, queens from that year at least. So if I do pull any of those queens to requeen my production hives, then I make sure to just drop a cell back in on the next round, because I've already grafted on June 5th. And I'm doing this, checking the first round of nukes in early June. Then once we get to mid-June, that's the round or time for a second split. And that would be, like the 16th or 17th of June, somewhere in that area. I leave everybody hopefully with around 6 frames of brood, and it should help stop swarming. Once again, it's just kind of a way to stop your bees from swarming and discourage them. Or like I said, it's not going to stop them, but it should hopefully deter them from swarming if they have less brood. Let me know in the chat if you have any questions. Here's some of the pollen. It's the first super of the year. When you add that frame to the middle of the brood nest, you get some pretty awesome comb. I love my queen cells. And here's some just capped brood that I would like to split. And you need some honey for your splits too. I don't use nuke boxes quite like that, but I was just trying to show you the rough idea. And we got the sugar syrup you want to feed the queen cells. And this is, just supposed to show adding supers in late May, hopefully around 2 or 3. This would be the second graft on the 5th of June. And this is just checking the mating nukes 2 weeks after they're installed. So now we're back up to making that second split. Same thing, split everybody down to around 6 frames of brood. Same makeup of the split, 2 frames of brood, 1 frame of food with a queen cell. And make sure you feed them. And ideally have all those factors in your favor for mating from earlier. I'm curious, let me know in the comments or the chat, do you guys have drone mating yards? And do you graft your own queens? I've been grafting queens, and I tried some drone flooding yards last year. They weren't quite the right distance, so I'm going to change that this year. But that's just a thing that I'm really curious about, to see who in my audience grafts queens and has drone flooding yards. And so now we're in mid-May or mid-June. We've made our second split with the same split composition of 2 frames of brood, 1 frame of food with the queen. I would probably still use the queen excluder method. You can find the queen and do it. It takes longer, unless you're really good at finding queens, in which it could take less time. And then you want to move those first round of nukes into larger boxes, and probably move them out of that apiary so they don't get too big and disturb your second round of mating. So especially the ones that you like, 20 or 30%, the queen won't come back. So you'll give that comb to other nukes. And so those nukes will grow even faster because they have drawn comb and don't have to draw out new comb. So pretty quickly you want to pull those out, move them out to your other apiaries, and move them into 10 frame boxes. Get five new frames of undrawn comb. And that undrawn comb should take them a while to get through, but if they're really strong and have a lot of forward momentum, they should pretty quickly be able to draw that out. And if you have drawn comb, sure, you can put it in there. But if they're really strong and we're pretty much getting the honey flow, it's probably not a bad idea to give them undrawn comb and let them draw it out. They should go through it pretty quick, and that'll ensure they don't swarm. Well, not 100%, but it'll help if they have more to do. So then you can do, if we're into late June now, take a sip of water here. So late June, you can do a third round of splits. Now, the trade-off with doing splits in any capacity is you're decreasing your potential honey production, especially because late June is our prime nectar flow. From probably around the 15th to the 4th of July is our best nectar flow, and it starts to tail off between like the 4th and 15th-ish. You know, it's not exact every year, but that's roughly what happens. So if you're, especially when you're splitting in the prime flow of the year, stops the colonies from foraging for a couple hours, weakens them. They have to draw more comb in the brood nest if you don't have drawn frames to give them. So it just weakens them. And so but you can do that third split and graft again in late June, so you can have even more colonies if you need them or want them for that winter. That's one other possible option. I don't know if I'm going to make that third round of split this year. We'll see. I'm not sure. Probably I'll need to, but I'm still ironing out my final plans. I'll make a video about it in the next couple weeks or so. So, we're in the prime honey flow in late June. The production colony should have 2 to 3 supers full of honey and pulling it in really, really fast. You'll want to check the second round of splits in late June, 14 days after you drop the queen cells. I like to check back. So that's late June in this case for the second round of splits. Same thing as the first round, go through each one. If you find eggs, leave them alone. If you don't find eggs, combine the frames and bees into the other hives. It'll strengthen them. And then any hives you didn't move out of the apiary from the first round of making nukes, they're definitely big enough now from the first round that you didn't pull out initially. Those will be plenty big enough on the verge of swarming. So you want to pull them out, throw them into a different apiary, put them into a 10-frame box, let them draw out that comb at the end of the honey flow. Hopefully you can get most of the comb drawn even before the dearth. And then you also want to, we're on to early July now, actually. So the first goldenrod blooms around the 4th of July. I know that sounds crazy, but yeah, it's actually true. The first goldenrod does bloom there. So here's a picture of how to move all the frames from your nuke that you made into your 10-frame box. Pretty simple concept. You put them in the middle. Not rocket science. Here's some full honey supers. You'll have those in late June. And this is what your nukes will look like in late June. It's such an awesome time of year, and the bees are really, really strong. So then you want to move that second round of splits into the second wave of your first round of splits into your 10-frame boxes. So now it's pretty much time to honey harvest. Early July, the goldenrod blooms, and you want to move the rest of your splits. All of them should be pretty much moved out of your mating nuke yard at this point. They'll all be pretty large. And the flow will be winding down at this point. Between, like the 4th and the 15th of July, the flow really starts to wane and then stop. And I like to do any final requeens this time of year if I have some production colonies that aren't up to snuff or went queenless and I somehow find out. I in past years have inspected during the honey flow. As I get bigger, I won't have time to, so I won't be able to do that. So then I do any more requeens if I need to. And then I like to have some backup nukes. So Ian Stepler has this. Pretty much all commercial beekeepers do this. They have a certain amount of their hives as nukes. So I want 40 colonies this year. So in early August, I want to have my 30 hives, 10 nukes for overwintering, and then I want to have 7 backup nukes. And the reason for that is if I have backup nukes, then I'll actually have the amount of hives that I want for winter. And you want to have about a third of your colonies as nukes, I wrote down 25%, I think. It's not an exact number. 20 to 30% of your hives ideally would be nukes in this system. And that will allow you to have backups, queens failing, hives weak, whatever it may be, drop in that brand new queen with her nuke, that hive will explode and be another productive hive. So it's an easy way to quickly fix your hives and get them right back on track without doing a lot of labor, giving a lot of effort, time into it. You're just drop the nuke with the new queen, the hive's done, everything's back to normal, and you're all good. And so you're also doing that. Then you get to mid-July, and the honey flow is over. It's so sad because it's the most fun time of the year. It's awesome, and bees are really happy during the honey flow. But the honey flow ends in mid-July, or is definitely over by mid-July. And around this time, the bees start to bring in the first goldenrod pollen of the year. And I also need to get my honey pulled off at this time. So mid-July, I pull all my honey supers, harvest them. And this is like probably one of the busiest times of the year. There are other times in the spring that are busy, but I want to get all the frames harvested or pulled off the hives, then extracted. Then I'll let them dry for a couple days before I extract them, just to make sure they don't have enough or don't have too much moisture. Though that isn't always a problem, so I can test them with my refractometer. $25, totally worth it. You can know whether your honey has too much moisture or not. And at this time, when I'm pulling the honey, I'm putting on wooden entrance reducers or metal ones. Metal ones are much better because they make sure that mice can't get in the hive, which doesn't matter during the summer, but in the fall and winter when the bees are clustered, it really does matter. Lost some frames to it, as I mentioned earlier. But if you put them on the small part of the wooden entrance reducer and not the big hole, then that could definitely decrease the likelihood in which they are robbed during the dearth or the mice get into the hives. So that's what I do at this time of year. And then since I run all single deeps, this could be easily modified to double deeps, but I run all single deeps, so I'm feeding all my hives. I could feed them thicker syrup for a short amount of time to get some weight back on them while they kind of decrease the size of the brood nest. But instead, I'd rather take this time to keep growing these or not growing them, but keeping them pretty strong and robust. So for 1 to 3 weeks, I will feed them light sugar syrup, half part sugar to 1 part water, or maybe 0.75 part sugar to 1 part water. And that will stimulate them to keep rearing some brood and still be strong, because in Maine, we don't get a pollen dearth. We have tons of pollen April through late September. And so I'm feeding them. I can add another box if I want to. If I want to add another deep on top and feed them and pull up some frames of larvae into the second box. If they were just producing honey like mad, then the bees will keep drawing comb. This is something that Cayman Reynolds does. Here's the goldenrod that's blooming in mid-July. So he, throws on another deep on the singles right at the end of the honey flow, feeds them like crazy, gets a bunch of comb drawn. That's definitely an option. It's more food. It's more feed. You have to feed them probably for longer, but it's a great way to get combs drawn. And if you get those comb drawn in July, then you can pull it out before winter and give it to your bees in the springtime. Having drawn comb can stop swarming in a lot of cases and just help them thrive in the springtime. Once you pull splits, you can put in drawn frames, and it will save the bees a lot of time, energy, and effort. Bees, I think of drawn comb as like stored bee energy. It takes like 8 pounds of honey to create 1 pound of wax. And so once they have that frame drawn, if you're able to preserve it over the winter time, which isn't too challenging, keep it out of harm's way, then you have a ton of stored bee energy to put in your hives to supercharge them in the springtime. Or if they have way too many honey frames, if you drop in that frame of drawn comb, bing, bang, boom, they have more space and they're much less likely to swarm as long as you do the right things. So when I'm also during this time of feeding, I'm treating them for testing them and likely going to be treating them for mites as well, depending on the test, but more than likely they'll have a high enough mite load in mid-July to late July that I need to treat them. And so I can only feed with certain treatments on, but you could open feed. That's a whole barrel of monkeys, maybe not the best idea. It depends on who you ask and depends on where you are. So as with all things in beekeeping, there are a million answers. So you kind of have to sort through what works for you, but treat for mites. Here's a picture of me testing with the Vito Pharma little test kit. That one was a 4. See those 4 little red dots, those are all mites. And that's Formic. That's my treatment of choice, but I need to change it up. to help stop any potential resistance developing in my mite population. So I'm hopefully going to be using, I've used some Avivar, some Formic, some Oxalic, and if the timing works out right, I want to try Apigard. So we'll see. We'll kind of see how that goes. I'll play by ear on that. But rotate your mite treatments so that your bees don't get resistance. And the two things to think about or the one thing to think about is temperature. If Formic Pro, you really don't want to treat unless it's 85 or below. And with Apigard, you can do a smaller dose when it's over 90, but I don't know if I have enough time between when I put on the Apigard and when I want to put my supers on in the fall, because you can't have supers on with Apigard. And so I really wouldn't want to necessarily use a lower dose of Apigard because it would just take too long for me to be able to add my honey supers on again in the same season. So as I'm talking about testing and treating for mites, the mites rapidly increase as the bee population decreases after the honey flow. The bees start to pull back, they have less brood, they have less bees eventually, and many of the bees die off pretty quickly because they're all old forager bees and they're not replaced at the same rate because the queen isn't laying as many eggs as she was during the honey flow because there's less food around. So those hives will pretty quickly decrease in size, which means your mite population is going to be proportional to the bees it'll increase and in overall numbers it'll increase. So then once you pull off your treatments in August, around that time is when I would stop feeding, 1 to 3 weeks. So, it depends on the hive, depends on whether I'm trying to get comb drawn, what's my goal. But after the treatment, I want to test for mites again. Well, we got 4 again. And once we test for mites again, we can figure out if we need to try a different treatment. You really don't want to use the same treatment back to back unless it's like Oxalic, because you can do that with Oxalic. But, test again, figure out what your mite loads are. Then this is in early August, and check all the hives, make sure they're queen right. You really would, at this time of year, you do want to try to get to every hive you can. Make sure they're queen right. If their queen's doing a crappy job, pinch her, add a new queen from one of your nukes, or just add the whole nuke into your hive. That's the easiest way, and they're way more likely to be accepted that way. So here's some of the goldenrod pollen. There's also this picture. Oh, it's being funky. Anyway, so there's the goldenrod pollen. That's a picture from August. We got a couple different types, but goldenrod's our main one that time of year. And so then it's time again, once you've gone through all your hives, made sure they're queen right, and they've got strong queens, you've requeened them with your nukes. You want to go in mid-August. You'll see lots of goldenrod pollen as shown on the screen, but they'll really still have almost no nectar. And so your feeding that you'll have done will hold them over for the rest of the summer until we get a fall flow or until you start feeding again. Then when we get to late August, another mite check, and then food checks on all the bees, make sure nobody's starving. And then I personally add 1 to 2 honey supers in late August, because we can get a really good fall flow. Like, it can be over 100 pounds or 0 pounds. So it's really highly dependent on the year. And so I want to be ready for that in good years, and I deal with it when it's not a good year. So I like to have my 1 or 2 supers on each colony. Then in early September, if we get a fall flow, it'll start around 1st to 5th of September-ish. And this last year, it started into August, but around the 22nd or 23rd, something like that, the bees started to draw comb again. And it was bright orange comb from the goldenrod. So now that you have mite treatments on the hives that needed it because you tested them in late August, the fall flow is starting in early September. And there's tons of pollen, regardless of whether we get, a fall nectar flow. There's tons of pollen in early September and late August. And then hopefully the supers begin to fill in early September. If you get a flow, that's what happens. And all your hives are being treated for mites that need it. You'd have to use a treatment that's okay for honey supers being on. So that would be Formic Pro. You could do Oxalic. It wouldn't be that effective because there'd be still a fair amount of brood. You could also try, forgetting the name, HopGuard. That's what it is. You can try HopGuard. I've heard it's not that effective, but I don't have any personal experience with it. Um, so yeah, treating for mites. And here's what your fall honey frame, that looks more like a summer honey frame because of how fat it is, but and how much wax there is, because the bees are more, they just like drawing wax much more in summer than they do in fall, uh, early spring, summer. So now it's mid-September and you want to pull all your honey supers so you have enough time to feed your bees, because instead of putting the honey in the bottom box, they'll put it in your supers. I mean, some hives are just annoying and won't do that, but either way, uh, that's a part of my management. You can tweak that and not add supers again and just let the bees fill up their box. But I prefer to harvest the honey and feed them back sugar syrup, and I'll explain that in a couple minutes why exactly that is. But you've got all your mite treatments pulled off. It's mid-September, and I pull off all the mite treatments, pull off all the honey, and then I'm feeding 2-to-1 sugar syrup. So when I'm feeding 2-to-1 sugar syrup, that'd be 16 pounds of sugar for every gallon of water when you're mixing it. And the hive should fill up really quickly on 2-to-1 sugar syrup. And if it's in mid-September, the bees still should have a really good population. And so they really pound down the sugar syrup super fast and are very good at storing it and drying it out really quickly. And so you're feeding tons of sugar syrup, and you get into late September, the pollen starts to slow down, which means the queen starts to slow down even more and lay less eggs. And the nectar outright stops typically in late September. We just stop getting any nectar at all. I like to do my final inspection in late September. That's when I do any final combines. If I got weak hives, combine them together. If I have a weak hive, I can throw a nuke in it. A lot of options if you keep those nukes around. And in queenless hives, once again, you can drop the nuke in. If you have an older queen, if you don't requeen every year, and you have an older queen and you have an extra nuke that's in a temporary nuke box, like an Easy Beasy, no, that's not it. An Easy nuke box, I can't remember the exact wording, but or like another one of those plastic ones. You can pinch the old queen and then combine the nuke into there and let that young queen live instead of the old queen. Or you could combine the brood into the colony with the older queen and just sell the queen, because in late September or mid-September, more like it, there's really high demand for queens, in the sense that not that many people want queens, but 0 beekeepers around you will have queens for sale. So people will really want them. Probably you'll quickly sell a couple that you do have. And now now we've got all the hives combined. They're all ready for winter. They're all being fed. And all the nukes you have are in either wooden or insulated nuke boxes. And that will allow them to make it through the winter. If you have plastic nuke boxes, I don't think that's enough insulation to make it through winter. I mean, maybe it's possible, but I doubt it. And so I'll feed those bees 3 to 4 weeks of with 2-to-1 syrup between mid-September and mid-October. And it should be about 50 to 60 pounds of sugar per colony. You're, of course, mixing it with water, but just like straight up sugar weight, that's how much it would be, which is around 3 to 4 gallons of 2-to-1 sugar water. And the reason why I like to harvest the honey and feed is, one, I make more money. If I harvest the honey and then feed them back sugar syrup, people are like, well, honey is way better for bees than sugar syrup is. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. There are certain honeys that are really good for overwintering bees on that have really low ash content. But there are other honeys that the bees that have a lot of ash content in them, such as aster honey, which is one of our main fall honeys that we produce with the goldenrod. And so if I do that and I let them overwinter on aster honey and they aren't able to fly for a couple months, we've been getting more flights during winter, but if they aren't able to, then they can get some diarrhea, and it can cause a lot of stress on the bees. So I rather feed the sugar syrup, harvest the honey. I get to build out my honey market, and the bees get completely clean winter feed for when, so they shouldn't have, or they should have less stress issues. So now, you're done feeding in mid-October. I'm lifting all the hives in early to mid-October, making sure they're heavy enough and adding more sugar water if necessary. Then, once they're all up to weight, I stop feeding them in mid-October. And then in late October, early November, they should be done with brood rearing. And at that point, they should be broodless. I give it a couple extra weeks after that before I treat with oxalic. But in mid to late November, I treat them with oxalic acid. twice. Here's a picture for feeding, and some caps brewed during the last inspection. Takes a lot of sugar. So now that it's mid-November to late November, you hit them with 2 rounds of oxalic acid, I'd say a couple days apart, and that should clean up any mites that are left. And that's really my whole beekeeping season. So I hope this helped out. I spent a couple hours today working this out for all of you, and I learned a lot. I mean, I had written down some ideas, but this is more specific than I'd gotten before. And this is all of my experience from the last 6 years of beekeeping. And I take pretty consistent notes, and I'm really pay attention and use my videos to plan out my season to get this. And everything that I use is a combination of so many things other people use in their beekeeping management to, kind of use it all together to create an effective management plan. And so this is not just random crap that I came up with. This is experienced stuff from other beekeepers, and I never do anything on my own hives that I don't know the reason why. So if someone just told you go do something because I said so, that's not a good advice. Unless they explain why, then it's not really valuable, and you shouldn't necessarily do it. So I tried to explain each reason for why I'm doing this and why each thing matters and in the timing of it. But if there's anything that confused you or I misspoke, just let me know in the comments, and I'll of course answer your questions, and we can discuss why I'm doing it. Or if you have some kind of critique, like not mean advice, but just a constructive criticism of my management, I'm happy to hear it, and we can talk in the comments about it. But I made a similar video to this that I will link after the live stream, where I do pretty much the same thing as this, but in 8 minutes. So it's just like a shorter, easier version to understand. And so if you want kind of a quicker recap of this video, I'll leave it up here after the live stream. And see you there. Bye.